Should the Dutch government send a cabinet representative to Qatar? And how or should we as football fans boycott this tournament? These dilemmas lead to heated debates in parliaments, in corporate boardrooms, but also at kitchen tables and probably in the common rooms of your student houses. Human rights were and are violated in Qatar. But what can we do about it? Welcome to this current affairs lecture organized by Radboud Reflects and the university's newspaper, Vox. Today we are going to discuss these dilemmas we are confronted with. But before we start, I first do a quick survey. Who in this room is going to watch the World Cup? And who is going to watch the World Cup but feels like they shouldn't? Okay, so a lot of people are struggling with these issues, and so are our speakers today. I will introduce them now. The first is Annick Pijnenburg. She's a scholar, law scholar, specializes in human rights, and she investigates especially migration control and state responsibility for refugees. The second speaker is Paul Reef. He's a historian, and he is doing research on protests against sports, mega sports events, I should say, since the 1960s. I am Adrien Duijfman, I work for Radboud Reflects. I will moderate this meeting. We will first start with an interview, and after that there will be plenty of time for you to ask your questions. So keep them, if you have a question, keep them in mind and you can ask them at the end. Before we are going to discuss all the topics, Paul, you are a historian, so you do research on the past, but now you're also in the middle of this sport tournament. You're writing about it, you're talking about it. Can you give us a quick update? What is going on in Qatar and why are so many activist groups protesting the tournament?
Sure, yeah. Maybe let's begin with a small disclaimer that I don't speak Arabic and I'm not per se an expert on the Gulf region, but I have been following the sport politics for a while. Essentially, what we're seeing is that Qatar has been using sports as a national soft power or prestige project for the last 15 years, ranging from sponsorship of European football clubs to, well, the current jewel in the crown, the World Cup in Qatar. And the reason why it's so contested is because, well, maybe because of two reasons. Firstly, because of the conditions of how the World Cup is organized and the repression and also bad conditions for labor migrants to work there, and the human rights generation in this authoritarian state in general. And secondly, why is this an issue around sport? Because it clashes with our conceptions of what sport should do or should be, that it's a force for good. And in the case of Qatar, it's painfully obvious that it's not the case. And over the past 12 years by now, there's been a lot of pressure on FIFA, on Qatar, for change around sport. So that's in short what's going on here.
Later on, we are going to discuss the second point, but the first point about the human rights situation. In the media, we hear a lot about these human rights, and I think that we all have a vague idea what they are, but maybe that's basically it, vague. So, Annick, how do you explain to your first-year law students what human rights actually are?
So, human rights are traditionally defined as the rights that we have, you and I, by virtue of being human. So because you're a human being, you have certain rights, and they're called human rights. So that's really the bottom line. And you see that very often these rights, they're laid down in law, for instance, in constitutions, like it's the case in the Netherlands, but also in international law, for instance, with human rights treaties.
And so they are laid down in laws and in these treaties, but how about this 1948 document, the Declaration? What is that? What's the legal value of that document?
So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, actually the name already says it, it's a declaration, and that means that in legal terms it's not legally binding. So it was drafted and it was adopted by the General Assembly of the UN, and it is very important, and some of the rights it contains have become customary laws, that's a form of unwritten law, but the document itself is technically not binding.
So there's no universal law book that states these human rights?
No, so there you don't have, at the national level you have a constitution, you have laws that are made by the legislator, so the government, the parliament. At the international level we don't have that. So there is no world government, there is no world legislator that makes laws. What happens is that states make law themselves. So a state chooses what rules it's bound by. And so international is really very much made by states. And within international law, human rights is a bit of a special category because it is obligations that states commit themselves to, but they kind of promise to respect the rights of human beings on their territory. So it has kind of this vertical relationship as well. And in terms of human rights, there are a number of human rights treaties. So for instance, in Europe, the European Convention on Human Rights, it's quite famous, you've probably heard about it. It has a European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. And at the international level, there are a number of human rights treaties as well.
And when we were talking about human rights in Qatar, Paul just mentioned the situation of the migrant workers, especially those from Nepal and India. About which specific human rights are we then talking?
So there's, if you talk about the labor migrants and their situation, there's a number of human rights violations. The most important one is that is often forced labor. So that's a human rights violation. The living conditions are very bad. So there's a number of so-called socio-economic rights that are also at stake, like the right to adequate housing, the right to health, etc. And when people die, well, obviously the right to health is also at stake. The right to life, sorry.
Yeah, so these are the specific rights that are violated in Qatar at the moment. Moving to our discussing the specific situation in Qatar, but also zooming a little bit out. Paul, you just mentioned soft power, national soft power. That is a reason why regimes organize sport events. You do research on these sport events like Argentina, South Africa. What is their aim? Why are they organizing these events?
Well, maybe first of all, we shouldn't forget that all states aspire to use sport for soft power. Maybe some of you remember the London 2012 Olympics, this extravaganza of Britishness and cool Britannia. Like all states use sport, and the next Olympics are in France and the US. But more and more so than in the past, we see authoritarian states with a lot of money or willingness to use their money to use sport, turn to sport as sports washing. And what we mean with sports washing is essentially the use of sports to increase the prestige of a country and to distract from human rights issues. And it's happening much more so than in the past, and this causes friction. That's essentially what we're talking about.
And so these regimes are sports washing the situation in their country. Zooming in on Qatar specifically, what are the motivations for the Qatari government to not only organize this, but also spend a lot of money on it? Yeah. Why is it so important for them?
Yeah, the government of Qatar, I'm not sure if you all know, has spent a really astronomical sum of money on this World Cup, over $200 billion US dollars. Their reasoning for Qatar specifically, like other authoritarian states like Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Saudi Arabia, which organize these sporting events, is a sports washing. And for Qatar, it's a very small state in the middle between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And for them, this is also about visibility, to be known, to be seen, spotted on the world map. And sports and also cultural projects are a means to become known around the world, to attract international attention. And also, that's their hope, when fossil fuels run out, to have a viable economic system around there. Maybe that's questionable with this criticism, but that's the long-term strategy around sport and why they're pouring so much money into it.
And has it also something to do with the geopolitical position of Qatar within the wider Gulf region?
Yeah, essentially for them, the hope is that with international entanglements like these, a couple of years ago there was an economic boycott against Qatar by Saudi Arabia, which actually threatened this World Cup being hosted at all. So for them, this is really a means of being noticed at all and not being entangled in geopolitical issues. Mm-hmm. That's really their long-term strategy with this. The Qatari government wants to polish up its image. One way they also did that is recently in 2018 ratifying 2 human rights treatises. Annick, why do states ratify these treatises?
It's in
I
their
think it can be because they generally believe that these treaties are good and that they really commit to it. That can certainly be the case, but I think in the case of Qatar, it really has to do with the international pressure that comes with the World Cup, and a little bit this idea of sports washing and showing, basically a way of deflecting criticism is saying, well, we have ratified these human rights treaties, so, we are committed to human rights, so, kind of get off our back a little bit.
So they ratified these two documents in 2018. Why are there then still violations of human rights?
That has to do with the fact that there is always a difference between what happens between the law on paper and reality. You see that very much at the national level. So in this country also we have laws that prohibit a certain number of things. That doesn't mean that those things don't happen. So there are laws prohibiting murder. That doesn't mean that murder doesn't happen. And at the international level, it's much more the case. So I already explained that there isn't like a world government that makes laws. And there also isn't like a world police that enforces these laws. So if a government like Qatar decides to ratify a human rights treaty, then how to implement it, there isn't really kind of the monitoring the implementation is really tricky at the international level. Fortunately, when we talk about human rights treaties are kind of a special kind of treaties, and they actually have monitoring mechanisms. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, the two treaties that Qatar has ratified in 2018, one is called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the other one is called the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And each of these treaties is monitored by a treaty body called a committee. So one is the Human Rights Committee, the other one is the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, that are part of the UN. They're based in Geneva, and these committees do a number of things. So states that ratify these treaties have to submit reports about the human rights situation in their country, and then the committees kind of enter a dialogue with states. They enter into a dialogue about these reports. There are also sometimes Qatar hasn't done it, but states can recognize the right of individuals to bring a complaint to these committees as well if they think that they are a victim of human rights violations. So that's some of them. So there are a few others, but that's the main monitoring mechanisms that there are at the international level.
And has this already happened? Are there, for instance, people in Nepal that have lost a relative that have made a case at these committees?
As far as I'm aware, not, because, well, against Qatar, certainly not, because Qatar doesn't recognize the rights of a victim to do so. About whether there has been a claim against their own country, I wouldn't be able to say.
Maybe to add to that, what complicates us further in the picture of Qatar is that the organizing committee is kind of pushing these reforms, but the Ministry of Labor and other ministries in Qatar are not such big fans of these reforms, which further complicates the picture. And paradoxically, hosting this World Cup has been the catalyst of some change. And FIFA has instated some mechanisms for complaints, but they're completely opaque and no one's really knowing what's happening. And we also don't know whether individuals have actually submitted issues to this FIFA mechanism. Mm-hmm. And the organizing committee says it's dealing with these complaints, but again, it's opaque and it's unclear how they do it and how they include companies in this. But so there is something happening, but it's complicated because it's not under the aegis of the states and who is doing it. So, yeah.
So would you say that the human rights situation, something has changed? Has it improved a little bit by this tournament, or didn't change it? Is it for the worse? Did it change for the worse?
Well, it hasn't become drastically worse. I think you have to disentangle two issues. That overall, some pledges have been made for heat protocols and a partial, not abolishment, but dismantlement of the so-called kafala system. At the same time, most of these changes are overseen by this organizing committee, which is going to be abolished after the World Cup. So who's going to ensure this legacy? Mm-hmm. On the other hand, incremental steps forwards have also been achieved by other Gulf states which did not host a World Cup. And that's the second issue, maybe, like massive human rights violations have taken place just by hosting this event, and also the sheer sum of money and the environmental damage caused by it. So it's a little difficult to say if one offsets the other.
In these debates in the media about these violations, or about human rights, it's interesting that human rights are such a topic of the debate. So why aren't journalists and protest groups not just writing, the Qatari government is treating migrant workers very badly? Why are they constantly referring to these human rights? Why has it such a moral authority, even if it's legally very difficult to enforce? Could you react to that?
So your question is why we feel like such a moral issue, rather not so much the legal issue.
Yeah, why are the human rights used in these debates, or are they made such an part of this debate? And why are we not just saying on other moral grounds, or just why are we not just saying that what happens in Qatar is bad or is inhumane? But then, of course, so why are human rights so much part of this discussion?
I think
it's the moral authority.
It goes back to what Paul was saying about the association we have with sports. And I think the idea that sports causes human rights violations, I think that's something that doesn't quite square in our idea of sports. I think that's I would think, the main issue.
Yeah, and also to add to that, historically this hasn't been the case, and sports organizations have always rejected human rights claims as something political beyond the realm of sport. But especially since the end of the Cold War, with relentless campaigning by human rights organizations, more recently also the UN, human rights have become the main moral rubric to frame issues under. And why is that the case? Well, human rights are universal, supposedly universal, like Aniek just said. And this ties in very nicely to sport, which also claims to be universal and superseding politics. So it's very, well, you could say opportunistic discourse to use because it ties into it, and people have been doing it for a while. And it's increasingly harder for sports organizations to reject this because they have been making largely rhetorical pledges to human rights as well, which causes issues in practice. But that explains it, why it's not about migrant rights per se, but they really choose this more universalizing discourse.
So these rights have a universal claim. The document in 1948 was called Universal Declaration. But you also hear there's also this non-Western critique that the human rights are very much a Western discourse or a Western idea. How do you reflect on that? Do you agree with that, or?
So if you look at kind of the history of human rights, at least the way we teach it traditionally in the West, its roots are very much Western. So we often refer to the US Bill of Rights, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. So that's very much Western. And human rights are very much, kind of the idea behind it is very much protecting the individual against the power of the state. And that's a very Western idea. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it was agreed upon in 1948. That was before decolonization, and it was very much a reaction to what happened during the Second World War, and especially what happened in Europe during the Second World War. So in that sense, the background is very Western. Having said all that, on the international and the legal sphere, you see that many human rights treaties have been ratified by also non-Western countries who weren't obliged to do that. They chose to do so. Maybe not always because of a genuine commitment, maybe for other reasons, but if, for instance, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, it has been ratified by every single country in the world, except for the USA, which has signed it. So I think that really shows that states worldwide recognize that, children have rights that must be respected. And I think if you pick a random person on the street, pretty much anywhere in the world, and you ask them, what are human rights? Give me a list of human rights. Chances are that they'll come up with a list that is very similar to what is listed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Yeah. And maybe also like the main human rights we're talking about here are not press freedom or political freedoms, which are more historically more closely associated with Western rights, but socio-economic freedoms, which have been pushed since the 60s and 70s by states from the global south. So it's a complicated picture, and I think here hosting states like Russia, China, Qatar claim this as Western to deflect this as something hypocritical. But we've moved beyond that by now because NGOs in the global south also say this around sporting events. So it's a little more complicated, but it's easy in debates to refer to it like that.
So we are not West-splaining Qatar when we are pushing for migrant rights.
Well, it's maybe hypocritical because our companies are heavily involved, but it's not per se West-splaining.
Clear. So these we are now. You just mentioned the companies. Human rights are agreed upon by states, but can you also use human rights to, for instance, to get a case to court for a construction firm that works in Qatar that builds one of these stadia?
That's a very good question. It's very much a debate that's ongoing in human rights today. So traditionally, as I explained, human rights states are the duty bearers of human rights because states ratify these treaties and they say, we have obligations to respect the human rights of people in our territory. And a construction company can't ratify a human rights treaty. But there is increasing recognition that some companies actually have more power than states, and they can also lead to human rights violations. And so one of the ways to go about it then is to say that states have an obligation to make national laws in such a way that obliges construction companies to respect human rights and to have national laws where in front of a national judge you can then bring a complaint against a construction company. And there is actually a case ongoing in France at the moment against one of the construction companies involved in Qatar for their involvement in Qatar. And the case is still ongoing, so we don't know what the outcome is, but that's how you see how that can kind of be a side way to still get to the construction companies.
And then how about sports unions?
That's even more complicated. So talking about FIFA is legally speaking an association under Swiss law, and that means that it has a lot of freedom to basically do what it wants. And it's very hard to it's not really submitted to public law, and that makes it really, really difficult. So there has been a case, the Dutch Confederation of Trade Unions, FNV, has brought a case in front of a Swiss judge against FIFA, but the case was dismissed on formal grounds. So here you see again that it can be hard to get to organizations that have a different structure that doesn't kind of fit into the traditional human rights idea of states and individuals, but these other actors who can also have an impact on human rights. Legally speaking, because of the way the legal system works, it can sometimes be very hard to kind of hold them accountable for their role.
It's interesting that even though these associations can escape these human rights laws, they still commit themselves to human rights laws. You went to Geneva, Paul, to delve into the archive there at the beautiful lake. Yeah. And how did you investigate this history? When did sport unions become interested in human rights, and what were the drivers for that?
Well, I'm not sure if they're per se interested in human rights, but essentially the driver for this has been external pressure. Mm-hmm. Like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all these treaties have always been sidelined by sports organizations as political. And also when larger protests emerged around the Olympics in Beijing in 2008 and other events, they've always tried to sideline this. And it's only because of rising external pressure now over Qatar and Formula One in Saudi Arabia and other countries that they're under pressure. And paired with that is another external factor, corruption scandals in FIFA and FBI investigations, a lack of potential host countries. So there are multiple external pressures on these sports organizations to do something with human rights. And FIFA implemented the human rights policy in 2017, for which it's very difficult to hold it accountable. And the IOC did something similar a couple of weeks ago. My feeling is that they've learned from companies that it's better to appropriate human rights as something universal and embrace it, rather than completely sideline it. So they can always say they're doing something about it and it's a force for good and they're moving in that direction. But the legal picture, just has been explained, is much more complicated. So it's much more of an instrumental turn to human rights under external pressure than a substantial turn. Although, of course, certain sports administrators do care about it. But for sports organizations, like since the late 19th century, they've been trying to maintain an international sports system without politics, which is a utopian fantasy. But for them, it's still very difficult to come to terms with this.
To come to terms with the fact that sports are political.
That they have obligations and that they're now, under the UN Guiding Principles for Human Rights in Business, they're classified as sort of businesses, even though they don't perceive themselves like this. Mm-hmm. And it's an ongoing struggle to hold them accountable. And maybe it's more fruitful to go via the national route, rather than try to convince the Swiss state that they should go after the chicken with the golden eggs.
We are we'll later come back to that. I just picked something out of your answer. You mentioned that one of the external pressures was the lack of host countries. Can you elaborate on that? How did that result in human rights endorsements?
Well, that's particularly the case for the IOC and a little less so for FIFA, because these events are so ludicrously expensive. 220 billion for this, the most recent Olympics around 40-50 billion US dollars. More countries are less inclined to host this, and more authoritarian states are inclined to host this. And this puts pressure on host countries because, on sports organizations, because if they lack host countries, their reason of existence is threatened if they can't find hosts, or if they're submitted to a single host, which can make big demands because there's no alternatives. So they realized they, on paper, have to shrink their economic and social costs, improve their human rights impact, improve their environmental impact. So far, all of these have actually become worse, but they are trying to work on this, but they don't really know how. And there's a lack of state or international oversight on them to do so. And that's the big issue, that this myth of the autonomy of sports, which is a myth, but we still kind of believe in it, and it obstructs movement forward.
So in democracies, the citizens are not very eager to host a mega sport event, but a dictator is stupid enough to do so.
Well, governments are very inclined to do so, like Paris and Los Angeles are hosting it. The citizens, they are less so. It's a political instrument to achieve certain goals.
Moving to the Q&A with the audience, I have two last questions. Two things I would like to ask your opinion about. Should the Dutch government send a cabinet representative to Qatar, to the tournament? What do you think? Aniek?
Well, I personally think that if you take human rights seriously, as this government claims to do, then I don't think you should. I think the reality of it is that human rights is seen as one of the elements in foreign policy, and there are also other interests at stake. And then if you decide that these other interests are more important, then you should at least be open about it and say it explicitly, because otherwise I think it is hypocritical, basically.
I agree. You shouldn't send someone unless you have a clear story about it. Like the German government has more so. From the beginning, they've said, "Well, we need the gas, but we're unhappy about the situation." German cabinets also said that in the future they want to have clear human rights norms for sport, and they've also implemented these at the national level with the National Football Association. So unless you come with a clear story and a move towards including sports in your national human rights legislation, the only reason of going is a fear of threatening your own commercial ties with the country and business as usual, which is essentially what our government has been doing since they claimed to protect human rights.
So for them, for our government, commercial ties are more important than human rights.
Yeah, and also they're very well aware that in Qatar, a blemish on the prestigious World Cup can be perceived quite seriously. But you could also argue that's precisely why you shouldn't send your king or monarch, but just an undersecretary.
And then moving on from what the king or the prime minister should do to what you do yourself, are you going to watch the World Cup?
I'm not a football fan, so I don't watch it anyway. So I'm very lucky I don't have to deal with the moral dilemma of it.
Okay, I see. So you are in that. For you, it's easy. For you,
I'm not a huge sports fan either. I would advise people that if you watch it via an illegal stream or something like that, because at the end of the day, like a sort of collective consumers boycott is more powerful than your individual statement. And FIFA and sponsors do register. Viewing numbers are decreasing, people interact with it less. They've for years believed that the sky is the limit and they can host anything anywhere without any obligations. So that's the most useful thing. Watch it anyway, do it via a stream, and maybe write a letter to your local MP or your football association, and that's what you can do.